Aelith hadn't come to the Luna ceremony to be chosen. She'd come to write down the names of the women who would be. That was her purpose tonight. The same purpose she served at every formal gathering in Thornhaven. Sit in the back, keep the quill moving, and make sure the records were clean. The kingdom's memory keeper. Invisible by design. The Grand Hall of Thornhaven was suffocating tonight. 300 wolves packed the vaulted stone chamber, their combined body heat turning the air thick and damp, despite the open windows. Banners bearing the Vale crest, a silver wolf mid-howl against a black field, hung from the rafters like warnings. Every noble family in the realm had sent their finest daughters, and those daughters stood in a line down the center of the hall, each one more stunning than the last. Aelith watched them from behind her ledger. Tall, poised, immaculate. Wolves with powerful bloodlines and names that mattered. Wolves who had actual wolves inside them. She pressed her quill harder against the page and focused on the list. Lady Odessa of Greymark, Lady Fenella of Ashbourne, Lady Sidera of Ironvale. 27 names. 27 women who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom for a chance to stand before the Alpha King. 27 women who were about to be rejected. Everyone knew it. The entire court knew it. 3 years, this ceremony had been held. 3 years. King Theron Vael had looked at every eligible Luna in his kingdom and said no. To every single one. No explanation, no reason given. Just that cold, immovable refusal, delivered with the detached precision of a man signing an unremarkable document. The whispers had grown vicious. He's broken. Some said. He doesn't want a mate. He'll die without an heir, and doom us all. Others were less generous. There's something wrong with him. Something dark. Something he's hiding. Aelith didn't whisper. She wrote. The ceremony began. The court fell silent as the Alpha King entered through the far doors. And even from the very back of the hall, Aelith felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. Theron Vael was the kind of man the word dangerous had been invented for. Tall enough that the doorframe seemed built to accommodate him, broad enough across the shoulders that 2 lesser men could have stood in his shadow. His dark hair was cropped close, and his jaw was set in a permanent line that suggested he had never once in his life been uncertain about anything. But it was his eyes that made people falter. Pale gray, like winter light through frosted glass, and absolutely devoid of warmth. Those eyes moved across the hall without lingering on anything, without acknowledging anyone, as though the 300 wolves in the room were furniture. Aelith dropped her gaze to her ledger. She was not the kind of woman a king's eyes should land on. She was wolfless. The lowest possible status a person could hold in a shifter kingdom. An orphan raised in the healer's wing by Brindis, the court's chief healer, who had found her as an infant wrapped in an unmarked blanket at the castle gates. No wolf, no bloodline, no name worth recording. The great irony of her existence. She kept the records of a people who would never see fit to record her. The ceremony proceeded as expected. One by one, the candidates stepped forward. One by one, the king looked at them with those pale, unreadable eyes, and one by one they were dismissed. No, no, no. His voice was low, flat, and utterly without emotion, like he was declining a second glass of wine. The court had stopped reacting after the 12th rejection. By the 20th, the silence had turned brittle. Lady Sidera of Ironvale was the last. She was exquisite, dark-haired and sharp-featured, with the bearing of a woman who had never been denied anything. She stepped forward with her chin raised and her golden eyes burning with confidence. The king looked at her longer than he'd looked at anyone else. Aelith's quill paused on the page. No, Theron said. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Lady Sidara's face went white, then red, and she stepped back without a word, though her hands trembled at her sides. It was over. 27 candidates, 27 refusals. The court was already shifting, murmuring, preparing to disperse, when the king did something he had never done before. He didn't leave. Theron Vael stood motionless at the front of the hall, his chin slightly lifted, those winter-gray eyes scanning the room like he'd lost something, or found it. The murmuring stopped. People noticed. People watched. His gaze moved past the candidates, past the nobles, past the advisors and guards and servants. It swept over the crowd like a searchlight, patient and deliberate, cutting through the bodies and the noise and the heat, until it reached the very back of the hall, until it landed on Aelith. The impact was physical. Like a hand pressing flat against her sternum, her quill slipped from her fingers and hit the stone floor, with a sound that shouldn't have been audible in a room this size, but somehow was. His eyes locked onto hers, and for one impossible, airless second, the entire world narrowed to the space between them. Then King Theronviel, who had rejected every Luna for 3 years, who had never once shown interest in anyone, opened his mouth and spoke 3 words that detonated the silence like a bomb. "Bring her to me." The hall erupted. Heads turned. 300 wolves craned to see who he was looking at, and Aelith felt every single gaze hit her at once like a wave of scalding water. She looked behind her. There was no one behind her. Just the wall and the door she suddenly, desperately wanted to run through. 2 guards were already approaching. Sorin, the king's beta, materialized beside her like a shadow given human form, his face carefully blank. "Miss," he said. "If you would." Aelith couldn't move. Her legs had disconnected from her brain. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "There's been a mistake," she managed. "I'm not a candidate. I'm the record keeper." Sorin's expression didn't flicker. The king doesn't make mistakes. He offered his hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she stood on legs that felt made of water and began the longest walk of her life. 300 wolves watched her cross the grand hall. 300 wolves, and she could feel every single pair of eyes, but the only ones that mattered were the pale gray ones waiting for her at the end. The chamber they brought her to was not the grand hall. It was smaller, warmer, lit by a fire that had burned down to deep orange coals. And a war room, judging by the maps pinned to every surface, and the heavy oak table scarred with blade marks. They left her alone in it for 11 minutes. She counted. Aelith stood in the center of the room, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and she tried to think clearly through the roar of her own pulse. This was wrong. All of it. She was nobody. She was less than nobody. She was the girl with no wolf in a kingdom that measured worth by the strength of the beast inside you. Whatever the king thought he'd seen when he looked at her, he was mistaken. And now she had to tell him so. To his face. The man who ended the Northern Rebellion by walking into the enemy camp alone and walking out carrying their leader's severed battle standard. "Wonderful," she muttered. "This is how I die." The door opened. Sorin entered first, his movements economical and deliberate, the kind of man who had never wasted a gesture in his life. His dark eyes swept the room once, verifying something invisible, before he stepped aside. King Theronviel walked in behind him and the room immediately felt smaller. Up close, the scale of him was almost offensive. He moved with the contained precision of something that had learned to be careful with its own strength, every step measured, every motion controlled, as though he was aware that one careless movement could break something. Aelith's mouth went dry. She pressed her nails into her palms and held her ground. "Your Majesty," she said, and was genuinely surprised. Her voice came out, steady. "There's been a misunderstanding." Theron's gaze settled on her face. At this distance, his eyes were worse. Not empty, not flat. Strained. Like someone was pressing hot iron behind his skull and he was holding his expression in place through sheer force of will. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he did something peculiar. He stood very still, his head tilted almost imperceptibly to one side, as though he was listening to something. Then his shoulders dropped by half an inch. The tension around his eyes eased fractionally. His breathing, which she now noticed, had been shallow and controlled, deepened. The change was so subtle that Aelith nearly missed it. but she spent her life watching people while pretending not to. And she saw the micro shift for what it was. Relief? What's your name? He asked. Aelith, Your Majesty. I'm the ceremony scribe. I keep the records for court proceedings. Aelith? He repeated, and hearing her name in his voice, did something to her chest that she was not prepared for. A low, warm vibration that settled beneath her ribs and stayed there. How long have you lived in the castle? He asked. My whole life, Your Majesty. I was raised in the healer's wing. By whom? Brindis, the chief healer. Something shifted behind his eyes. And your parents? Unknown, Aelith said, keeping her voice neutral through years of practice. I was left at the gates as an infant. Theron studied her for a long moment, and Aelith felt like she was being read, not just observed, but decoded, layer by layer. Then he turned to Soren. How long has it been? The king asked. Soren checked a pocket watch. Roughly 4 minutes, Your Majesty. Theron closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just a brief flutter of lashes. But the relief that crossed his face in that unguarded moment was so profound it startled her. Like a man surfacing after being held underwater. 4 minutes. He murmured almost to himself. That's already longer than. He stopped. His jaw tightened. Whatever he'd been about to reveal, he swallowed it back down and rebuilt his composure with visible effort. Aelith looked between the king and his beta, searching for context. Your Majesty, I don't understand why I'm here. No, Theron agreed. You wouldn't. He crossed to the table, putting distance between them, and she noticed his hands. They were shaking. Not visibly, not to a casual observer, but the tremor was there. A constant, low-frequency vibration in his fingers that he controlled by gripping the table's edge. I need to ask you something, he said, not looking at her. And I need an honest answer. Of course. Can you hear anything unusual right now? Anything that shouldn't be there? Aelith frowned, listening. The fire. The wind outside. The distant murmur of the court dispersing below. No, Your Majesty. His grip on the table tightened. Nothing at all. No voices. No sounds that don't belong. No, she said, now genuinely confused. Should I be hearing something? A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a breath. Something raw and involuntary that he clearly hadn't meant to let out. He turned away, pressing one hand against his temple, and Aelith saw Soren take a half-step forward, concern breaking through his careful blankness for the first time. Your Majesty, Soren began. I'm fine. The words were clipped, automatic. The kind of response that had been repeated so many times, it had lost all meaning. Silence settled over the room. Theron stood by the window, one hand still pressed to his temple, his silhouette carved sharp against the firelight. Then he spoke without turning around. Miss Aelith, beginning tomorrow, you will be reassigned from the records office. New quarters will be arranged for you in the East Wing. Aelith blinked. The East Wing? That's the royal residence. Yes, Your Majesty, with respect. I haven't agreed to anything because I don't know what's being asked of me. Theron turned. His expression was closed, controlled, but something burned behind it, something urgent and barely contained. I am asking, he said carefully, for your proximity. The word landed strangely. Not loyalty, not service, not fealty. Proximity. For how long? She asked. I don't know yet. Another silence. Aelith felt the weight of what was happening settling over her. Something was wrong with the king. Something serious enough that, finding her, whatever she represented, had caused visible relief in a man who showed nothing. Can you at least tell me why? She asked quietly. His jaw worked. She watched the muscle jump beneath the skin. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer. Soren will explain what he can, Theron said instead. He moved toward the door, pausing as he passed her. Close enough that she caught his scent. Cedar smoke and iron and something deeper that made her pulse stutter. Thank you, he said, low enough that only she could hear, for the silence. Then he was gone, and Aelith was left standing in the war room with a cold fire and a beta who looked at her like she was either a miracle or a catastrophe. What did he mean? Alice said slowly. By the silence? Soren regarded her for a long moment. Then he pulled the door shut. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. The East Wing was absurd. Alice's previous quarters had been a narrow room off the healer's wing, barely wide enough for a bed and a writing desk. With a window that faced a brick wall, she had loved it. It was hers. This was something else entirely. A sitting room with actual furniture that matched. A bedroom with a mattress thick enough to drown in. Windows that looked out over the palace gardens where moonlight turned the hedgerows silver. And directly across the corridor, behind a set of reinforced oak doors that 2 guards flanked at all times, were the king's chambers. This is too much, Aelith said, standing in the center of the sitting room with her single bag of belongings clutched against her chest. The king's orders, Soren replied from the doorway. The king could have put me in a broom closet, and it would have been an upgrade. Something that might have been amusement crossed the beta's face, but it vanished before she could be sure. A servant will bring the rest of your things from the healer's wing. This is the rest of my things, Ilis said, lifting the bag slightly. Soren looked at the bag. It was not large. His expression didn't change, but something in his silence felt distinctly uncomfortable, as though her poverty had embarrassed him on her behalf. Breakfast is at dawn, he said. You'll be expected in the king's study by the 7th bell. Expected to do what? Be present. And then he left. Aelith stood alone in her absurd new rooms and tried to process the last 3 hours of her life. One moment she'd been recording names in the back of a hall. Now she was living across from the king because he needed her proximity, which apparently meant her physical nearness quieted something inside his head. She hadn't fully understood Soren's explanation, hadn't wanted to, if she was honest. But the pieces he'd given her were enough to construct a picture she wished she hadn't seen. The king heard voices, not the metaphorical kind, not the whispers of doubt or ambition that plagued all rulers. Real voices. A constant, relentless flood of sound that never stopped, never dimmed, never gave him a moment's respite. Every death in his territory echoed through his mind. Every wolf that drew its last breath sent a final scream through the king's skull, like a nail being driven in. It had started the night his father died, and the crown passed to him, 3 years ago. Years of unbroken noise. Aelith couldn't imagine it. She tried, lying in her enormous new bed, staring at the ceiling, and she tried to picture what it would be like to hear every dying scream in a kingdom of thousands, to never have silence. Not while eating, not while speaking, not while trying to sleep. No wonder he looks like that, she thought. No wonder his hands shake. She slept poorly and woke before dawn, disoriented by the unfamiliar softness of the mattress and the strange quality of the light. She dressed quickly, twisted her pale hair into its usual knot, and presented herself at the king's study at the 7th bell. Theron was already there, seated behind a desk, buried in correspondence. He glanced up when she entered, and she watched it happen again. That fractional easing, the almost imperceptible loosening of the vice around his expression. "Good morning, Your Majesty," she said. He nodded, said nothing. Returned to his work, Aelith stood awkwardly for a moment, then chose a chair against the wall and sat. She'd brought her ledger, a force of habit, and after a few minutes of painful silence, she opened it and began organizing the ceremony records from the night before. An hour passed. 2 advisors came and went. The king reviewed border reports, signed documents, and dictated a letter to a provincial governor. Aelith sat in her chair, wrote in her ledger, and tried to take up as little space as possible. The change came during the 2nd hour. Theron's handwriting had started the morning tight and cramped. The letters pressed hard enough to dent the desk through the parchment, but as the minutes passed, the script had loosened. The letters grew taller, the spacing more even. His shoulders, which had been braced like he was preparing to take a blow, gradually settled downward. She was watching his transformation in real time. Her presence was doing something to him, something measurable and visible, and it both fascinated and terrified her. At the 3rd hour, Aelith was deep in her records when she began to hum. It was unconscious, a melody Brindis used to sing while grinding medicine. So familiar it lived in Aelith's body more than her mind. She didn't even realize she was doing it until the room went quiet. She looked up. Theron had stopped writing. His pen rested against the page, his hands still, his eyes were closed. Aelith froze. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't mean to." "Don't stop." His voice was rough, lower than usual. His eyes stayed closed, and in the golden morning light, slanting through the window, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, like old stonework, shadows beneath his eyes, deep enough to hold water. Lines around his mouth that didn't belong on a man his age. Aelith swallowed and kept humming. She watched his breathing deepen, watched the furrow between his brows smooth, watched his lips part slightly as the tension drained from his face like water from a cracked vessel. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him, like he wasn't in pain. Something pulled in her chest, not pity. Something fiercer than that, something protective and aching that had no business being there. She didn't know this man. She owed him nothing beyond the respect due a king. But watching him find, even a few seconds, of peace made her eyes sting. She hummed until the melody ran out, and then she hummed it again, and when the advisors returned for the afternoon session, Theron opened his eyes and was the cold, controlled king once more, as though the moment had never happened. He didn't thank her. He didn't acknowledge it at all. But that evening, when Aelith returned to her quarters, she found a package on the writing desk. She opened it carefully. Inside was a set of new quills, the expensive kind with steel nibs that didn't need sharpening, and a journal bound in deep green leather, finer than anything she'd ever owned. There was no note. Aelith ran her fingers over the leather and bit her lip against a smile that felt dangerous. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. She arrived at the 7th bell. She sat. She worked. She existed near him, and his pain lessened. In the evenings, she returned to her rooms and found small additions: a wool shawl draped over the back of her chair, a tin of the blackberry tea she'd mentioned, preferring in passing, to a servant. A second candle on her desk because she squinted when she wrote by single flame. He never mentioned any of them. When she thanked him for the tea, his response was, "The Kitchens must have sent it. The Kitchens have never once remembered my name, Your Majesty." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He returned to his documents. On the 4th day, the court found out. Aelith was crossing the inner courtyard when Lady Sidera of Ironvale stepped into her path. The noblewoman was flanked by 2 others. Their expressions, a carefully arranged mixture of disdain and false concern. "So you're the one," Sidera said, looking Aelith up and down with a gaze that catalogued and dismissed in a single sweep. "The wolfless girl he's keeping." Aelith's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. Years of being invisible had taught her how to absorb a blow without showing it. "I'm not sure what you've heard, my lady," Aelith replied evenly. "I've heard the king pulled a nobody out of the back of his own ceremony and installed her in the royal wing. I've heard she sleeps 10 steps from his door." Sidera leaned closer, her voice dropping to something sharp and intimate. "I've also heard she has no wolf, which means whatever he's keeping you for, it isn't because you're his mate." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. "It must be something else," Sidera continued, her golden eyes glittering. "Something less dignified." Aelith said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around a knot of shame, so old and so familiar it felt like muscle memory. She stepped around Sidera and walked away. She wanted to, but she didn't. She walked with her back straight and her hands steady until she reached the healer's wing and pushed through the door and found Brindis, and only then did her composure crack. "What happened?" Brindis asked, already moving toward her. "Nothing. I haven't heard before," Aelith managed. Brindis studied her face, then pulled out a chair. "Sit." Aelith sat. And after a long, unsteady breath, she told Brindis everything. The ceremony, the East Wing, the king's voices, the silence she apparently carried, all of it. Brindis was quiet through the whole account, her weathered hands still, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When Iolith finished, the healer leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Well," Brenda said, "that explains several things." Before Aelith could ask what things, a knock sounded at the door. Soren stood in the corridor, his expression tighter than usual. "Miss Aelith?" he said. "The king is asking for you." "It's nearly midnight," Brenda objected. "Yes," Soren agreed, something strained passing across his face. "It is." The walk to the king's chambers felt endless. The corridor was dark, the torches guttering in the draught, and Soren's silence was heavier than usual. When they reached the reinforced doors, Aelith could hear something from inside. Not shouting, not crashing, something worse. A low, sustained sound, barely human, like a man trying to hold his skull together with his bare hands. Soren pushed the door open. The king's chambers were dark. Papers were scattered across the floor. A chair was overturned. And Theron Vale, the most powerful Altha in the realm, was on his knees by the window, his hands pressed against his ears so hard his fingers had gone white. His eyes found hers across the room, and what she saw in them wasn't the cold authority of a king. It was desperation. Raw, undisguised, animal desperation. And then Aelith heard it, faint, like a sound carried from very far away. Screaming. Dozens of voices, layered and tangled, rising and falling in waves of pure anguish. She could hear what he heard. Aelith didn't think. She moved. She crossed the room in 4 strides, dropped to her knees in front of him, and did the only thing that felt right. She reached out and pressed her hands over his. The effect was instantaneous. The screaming cut out like a candle being snuffed. 1 second, it was there, a wall of tangled anguish pressing against the inside of her skull. And the next, nothing. Absolute, ringing, crystalline silence. Theron gasped. His entire body shuddered, his hands dropping from his ears, his head bowing forward until his forehead nearly touched her collarbone. His breathing came in ragged, broken bursts, and she could feel the tremors running through him like aftershocks. Aelith held still. Her own heart was hammering, her own mind reeling from what she'd just heard, but she kept her hands on his and didn't move. "I'm here," she said. "It's quiet now." A sound escaped him, not a word. Something deeper, more animal, a low exhale that carried the weight of years of unbroken suffering. His forehead dropped the remaining inch and came to rest against her shoulder, and she felt the dampness of sweat soaking through the fabric of his shirt. This close, she could smell him. Cedar smoke and iron and the sharp, acrid edge of adrenaline. They stayed like that, on the floor of his chambers, the firelight dying around them, until his breathing steadied and he grew still. Minutes passed. Neither moved. The silence between them was so complete, it felt sacred, like something that would shatter if either of them acknowledged it. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red-rimmed and raw in a way that made her chest physically ache. The king was gone. The mask was gone. What remained was just a man, exhausted and exposed, and looking at her like she'd pulled him out of the sea. "You heard them," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," his jaw clenched. "That shouldn't be possible. No one else has ever." He stopped. Something complicated moved across his face. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Aelith said quietly. "Enough to understand why you haven't slept in 3 years." He looked away. The vulnerability that had been cracked open on his face was already sealing shut, the walls rebuilding themselves in real time, and Aelith could see the effort it cost him. The way he gathered himself back together piece by piece, like a man reassembling broken armor while still bleeding. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "It changes everything," she countered. "It changes nothing. The voices return the moment you're not here. They always return. Tonight was worse, because there was a border skirmish in the Eastern Territories. When wolves die violently, the sound is..." He swallowed, louder. The implication landed with sickening weight. Every violent death in his kingdom registered inside his skull like a detonation. Every skirmish, every accident, every tragedy compounded the noise. And he endured it silently, day after day, while ruling a kingdom that had no idea their king was being slowly torn apart from the inside. "Then I'll stay," she said. The words left her mouth before she'd fully processed them. Theron's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and searching, and she felt heat climb her neck, but held his stare. "You don't know what you're offering," he said. "I'm offering to sit in a room with you. I've been doing it for 4 days. At night, it's worse. The voices are louder. There are more of them." His voice dropped. "I am worse." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his mouth tightened, the way his gaze shifted slightly left, refusing to meet hers fully, the most powerful alpha in the realm, confessing that he was afraid of what she'd see if she stayed after dark. "Your Majesty," Ilis said carefully, "I have spent my entire life in a kingdom that considers me broken because I don't have a wolf. I know what it feels like to carry something that shames you, and I know what it costs to carry it alone." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Theron studied her face for a long time. Then he stood, extended a hand, and helped her to her feet. His palm was warm and rough and slightly unsteady, and when their skin touched, she felt that vibration again, the one that settled beneath her ribs and hummed like a tuning fork. "One night," he said. "We try one night. If it's too much, you leave and we find another way." "Agreed. You'll sleep there." He gestured to a long couch beneath the window, where someone had already placed a pillow and a folded blanket. She looked at the arrangement, then at Soren, who stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he'd prepared for this outcome before either of them had arrived at it. "Presumptuous," Aelith muttered. "Efficient," Soren corrected. That first night rewired everything she thought she knew about him. The cold, controlled king she'd observed from across halls and through doorways was a performance, a sustained, exhausting act of containment. In private, stripped of his audience, Theron Vial was someone else entirely. He was restless. He paced. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing it. He stood by the window and pressed his fingers to his temples and closed his eyes, and she could track the moments when the voices surged. By the way, his body tensed every muscle, locking at once before gradually painfully releasing. But with her in the room, the surges came less often. The intervals between them stretched longer. And when sleep finally dragged him under around the 2nd hour, it held him for the rest of the night. Aelith lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like cedar and iron, listening to the king breathe in the dark, and felt something dangerous taking root in her chest. Over the days that followed, the arrangement solidified into routine. She arrived at his chambers each evening. After the palace quieted, he pretended her presence was incidental. She pretended she couldn't feel his relief the moment she walked through the door. They didn't speak much at first. He worked. She wrote. The quiet they shared was comfortable in a way that surprised her, as though the absence of sound was something they both understood at a bone-deep level. 2 people fluent in the language of quiet. But gradually, the quiet began to crack. "You write constantly," he observed one evening, not looking up from his reports. "What are you writing?" "Everything. Court records, ceremony logs, birth registries, death notices. I've been doing it since I was 12. You enjoy it. I'm good at it. That's not the same thing." He looked up at that. "What would you do if you could choose?" Nobody had ever asked her that. The question landed with unexpected force, and she stared at her ledger for a long moment before answering. "I'd write something that mattered. History's the real kind, not the kind nobles commission to make themselves look good." The corner of his mouth twitched. "You have opinions about the court histories. Your grandfather's biography claims he single-handedly held Ashenmere Bridge against 40 soldiers. The bridge is 6 feet wide. 40 men couldn't even stand on it." Theron stared at her. Then he laughed, brief and startled. The sound seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and it transformed his face so completely that Aelith forgot to breathe. The hard lines softened, the shadows retreated. For exactly 3 seconds he looked young and unguarded and devastatingly alive. Then it was over, and he cleared his throat and returned to his report. and she returned to her ledger and neither of them mentioned it. But that night, before she fell asleep, she heard him say her name. Very softly, almost to himself, like he was testing the shape of it. Aelith? She didn't answer. She closed her eyes and held the sound of it close, warm and quiet and terrifying, and knew with absolute certainty that she was in trouble. 2 weeks in, and Aelith had learned the geography of the king's suffering. Mornings were manageable. The voices were quieter during daylight, reduced to a low murmur that Theron could suppress with effort. By mid-afternoon, they intensified. By evening, they were a flood. And at night, when the kingdom's wolves slept and their defenses dropped, the dying echoes of every soul lost during Theron's reign crashed through his mind like a tide against rock. Her presence held the tide back. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough for him to think clearly. Enough for him to eat without his hands betraying him. Enough for him to sleep. She hadn't told anyone about the price. It started small. A headache after leaving his chambers, that she attributed to fatigue. A ringing in her ears that faded after a few hours. A momentary flash of sound, a woman's scream, distant and warped, that cut through her thoughts while she was organizing supplies in the infirmary and disappeared before she could fully register it. She told herself it was nothing. Residual stress, overactive imagination. Then it got worse. The fragments came more frequently, snatches of voices breaking through like signals from a damaged radio, a child crying, a man gasping for breath, a wolf howling in a register that shouldn't have been audible to human ears. They crept in during quiet moments, while she was bathing, while she was eating alone, while she walked the corridors between Brindis's domain and the royal quarters. They were loudest in the hours after she left Theron's side, as though whatever part of her absorbed his silence was leaking, overflowing, unable to hold the residue of what she filtered. She hid it. She hid it the way she'd hidden every difficulty her entire life, quietly, competently, with a neutral expression and steady hands. She took willow bark for the headaches. She hummed to drown out the ringing. She pressed her nails into her palms when the voice fragments hit, and she breathed through them until they passed. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed what was happening to Aelith. That was, after all, the story of her life. Except the king was starting to notice other things. He noticed that she squinted in bright light, now turning away from windows she used to sit beside. He noticed that she pressed her fingers to her temple when she thought he wasn't looking, the same gesture he made when the voices surged. He noticed that her hands, which had always been steady, occasionally trembled when she reached for her quill. "Are you sleeping?" he asked one morning. "Yes, Your Majesty. You're lying." "I'm being polite." His eyes narrowed. "When I ask you a question, I expect honesty, not politeness. Then perhaps you shouldn't ask questions before breakfast." She deflected with humor because the truth was too complicated. The truth was that she was starting to hear the echoes even in sleep. Brief, fractured nightmares that weren't hers. Fields she'd never walked. Faces she'd never seen. A visceral terror of something vast and hungry closing in. She woke from them gasping, disoriented, unsure for several seconds whether she was Aelith or someone else entirely. But Theron was sleeping, finally, truly sleeping through the night, and the change in him was remarkable. The bruised shadows beneath his eyes were fading. The tremor in his hands had steadied. He moved through his days with an energy and clarity that the court had never seen, and the kingdom was better for it. Advisors who had been managing a barely functional ruler now answered to a sharp, decisive king. She wouldn't take that from him. Whatever was happening to her was a small price. Meanwhile, the time they spent together grew warmer without either of them deciding it should. The formal distance of the first week had dissolved into something that resembled, dangerously, friendship. He asked about her childhood. She told him about growing up in the healer's wing, about Brindis teaching her to read using medicine labels, about the years of watching noble children train to shift while she sat apart, knowing her body would never answer that call. "Did it hurt?" he asked. "Watching them? Every time?" He was quiet for a moment. "My first shift nearly killed the boy standing next to me." The force of it threw him across the training yard, broke his collarbone. He paused. After that, they made me shift alone, every time alone in a stone room, reinforced for containment. Aelith looked at him. We're a matched set, aren't we? I couldn't shift at all, and you couldn't shift safely. Both kept separate for different reasons. Theron agreed. Both told something was wrong with us. The words hung between them. He held her gaze, and something passed through his expression that she couldn't name. Something raw and recognizing, as though he was truly seeing her, and finding something there that mirrored himself. That night, she woke from a nightmare. Not one of the echo nightmares, but a real one, her own, the old dream, the one she'd had since childhood, standing at the castle gates as an infant, watching a faceless figure walk away, abandonment distilled into its purest form. She woke silently, years of practice keeping the gasp contained, but when she opened her eyes, Theron was sitting up in bed, looking at her through the dark. "You were dreaming," he said. "I'm fine. You're shaking." She looked down at her hands. He was right. She clenched them into fists and pressed them against her thighs. The mattress shifted. She heard him cross the room, felt him settle on the edge of the couch beside her. Close enough that the warmth of his body reached her through the blanket. Close enough that she could hear his breathing, slow and deliberate, as though he was consciously steadying it for both of them. "What was it?" he asked. His voice was different in the dark, softer, stripped of its authority. "The old one," she said quietly. "The one where I watch my parents leave." "How often?" "Less than it used to be." She paused. "More, since I've been here." He didn't respond immediately. Then she felt his hand find hers in the dark, his fingers threading through hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that large. "You are not what they left behind," he said. "You are what they lost." Aelith's breath caught, her vision blurred. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper, because if she started crying now, in front of him, in the dark, she would never recover. "That's the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me," she whispered. His hand tightened around hers. "Then people haven't been saying enough." Neither of them let go. She fell asleep with his hand in hers, her pulse beating against his palm, and when she woke in the morning, he was back in his bed, and neither of them mentioned it. But something had shifted. The space between them had narrowed to a crack, and through it, light was pouring in from both sides. 3 days later, it shattered. Aelith was in the healer's wing, reorganizing Brindis's supply shelves, when the sound hit. Not a fragment, not an echo, a full, sustained wave of screaming that tore through her skull like a blade. She dropped the bottle she was holding. It shattered on the stone floor, her knees buckled. She caught herself on the shelf, knocking vials and jars loose, and pressed her forehead against the wood as the sound crashed over her in pulses. Aelith. Brindis was beside her in seconds. "What's happening?" She couldn't answer. The voices were inside her, a cacophony of final moments, each one distinct and agonizing, layered on top of each other until the noise was almost physical. She could feel it pressing against the inside of her skull, could feel it in her teeth, her spine, the roots of her hair. Then, as quickly as it came, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, and Aelith sagged against the shelf, gasping, her face wet with tears. She didn't remember crying. Brindis was holding her shoulders. "What was that?" "Aelith, look at me." The voices. Aelith managed, her own voice coming out wrecked and hollow. "I can hear them." His voices. Brindis went very still. "How long?" Aelith closed her eyes. "Weeks." The look on Brindis's face was one she'd never seen before. Not concern, not surprise. Fear. Brindis made her sit, made her drink water, made her breathe. Then the healer pulled a chair close, gripped both of Aelith's hands, and spoke with a steadiness that Aelith recognized as deliberately controlled. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Every symptom, every episode, every moment you chose to hide instead of speak." The word "chose" landed like an accusation. Aelith flinched. "I didn't want to worry anyone." You didn't want them to take you away from him, Brindis corrected, not unkindly. The silence that followed was its own confession. Aelith told her. All of it. The headaches, the ringing, the voice fragments that started as whispers and grew into shards. The echo nightmares that weren't hers. The way the symptoms worsened every time she left his side, as though the distance itself was poison. Brandis listened without interrupting. When Aelith finished, the healer rose and moved to her bookshelves, pulling down a volume, so old its spine cracked when she opened it. There's a word for what you are, Brandis said, turning pages with careful fingers. In the old texts, before the bloodlines diluted and the old wolves died out, there were certain wolves whose purpose wasn't to fight or to lead. They were called silencers. Alyth frowned. I'm not a wolf. I don't have a wolf. You don't have a wolf that shifts, Brindis corrected. That's not the same thing. She found the page she was looking for and turned the book toward Alyth. The illustration was faded, the ink brown with age, but the image was clear, a figure kneeling beside a fallen wolf, hands pressed against its head, and from between their fingers, lines of light radiating outward like cracks in glass. Silencer wolves were psychic absorbers, Brindis continued. Their gift wasn't physical transformation. It was the ability to take psychic damage, curses, mental attacks, spiritual contamination, and neutralize it. They processed what would destroy others. She paused. The bloodline was thought to have been lost centuries ago. You think I'm a silencer? Aelith said flatly. Me, the girl with no wolf. I think you've had a wolf your entire life, Brindis said, her voice gentle. One so different from what we expect that no one recognized it, including you. The words settled over Aelith like a weight. She thought of every ceremony she'd watched from the margins. Every child who shifted while she stood apart. Every whisper. Every pitying glance. Every time someone said wolfless, like it meant worthless. What if they'd all been wrong? What if she'd been wrong about herself her entire life? If this is true, Aelith said slowly, then what's happening to me isn't just proximity. I'm not just quieting his voices by being near him. I'm absorbing them. Yes. And that's why I'm hearing them when I'm alone, because I'm carrying them. Yes. And there's a limit, Aelith continued, her voice dropping. To how much I can carry? Brindis didn't answer. Aelith pressed her palms flat against the table. Does the king know? I don't believe so, but when he finds out, he'll send me away. The certainty in her own voice surprised her, but she knew Theron now. She knew the shape of his guilt, the way he hoarded responsibility like a dragon hoarding gold, the way he'd rather destroy himself than risk harm to someone else. If he learned she was being damaged by helping him, he wouldn't hesitate. You need to tell him, Brindis said. I will, but not yet. Not until we understand it better. If there's a way to stabilize the absorption, if the old texts have some method. Aelith. He's sleeping, Brindis. Her voice cracked on the word. For the first time in 3 years, he sleeps through the night. He eats. He laughs. I've heard him laugh. Her eyes stung. If he sends me away, all of that stops. He goes back to the screaming. He goes back to dying. Slowly. I can't. She pressed her hand over her mouth. I can't do that to him. Brindis regarded her for a long-waited moment. You love him, she said. Aelith didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. Brindis sighed, deeply and with the resignation of a woman who had raised a stubborn child and should have expected exactly this. Then we work fast. I'll research the silencer bloodline. There may be a way to stabilize what's happening to you, a way to let you absorb and release rather than just absorb and hold. But Alyth, her voice hardened. If the symptoms worsen, you tell him, immediately, promise me. She went back to his chambers that evening, carrying the weight of a secret and the ghost of 100 screaming voices. Theron was by the window when she entered, reading a field report, and his head lifted the moment the door opened. You're late, he said. By 4 minutes. I noticed. Something warm flickered in his expression before he smothered it. She took her place on the couch, opened her ledger, and tried to pretend her hands were steady. That night, she woke to find his hand already wrapped around hers, not fumbling for contact in the dark, not reaching across the distance, already there, as though he'd taken hold before she fell asleep, waiting to ensure the silence held. She stared at their joined hands in the faint moonlight. His fingers were long, calloused, scarred, across the knuckles from years of combat. They dwarfed hers completely. And yet, the grip was impossibly gentle, as though he was holding something he was afraid to break. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Yes, go back to sleep. I will if you will." A pause. Then his thumb traced a slow circle against her palm, and the sensation sent a cascade of warmth down her arm that pooled somewhere behind her sternum. "Bossy," he murmured. "Stubborn," she countered. His thumb kept tracing. She closed her eyes. They fell asleep together, hands intertwined, the silence humming between them like a living thing. 4 days later, the king found out. He found out because Eilith collapsed in his study. It happened without warning. One moment, she was seated in her usual chair, transcribing notes from the morning's council session. The next, a wave of sound tore through her so violently that her vision went white. She heard herself cry out, felt the ledger slip from her fingers, felt the chair tip sideways as her body followed. She hit the floor. The impact jarred through her shoulder, but the pain was distant, irrelevant compared to the roar inside her head. Voices upon voices, cresting and crashing, and beneath them a sound she hadn't heard before, low and resonant and ancient, like a bell being struck at the bottom of the sea. "Eilith!" Hands on her shoulders. His voice cutting through the noise, with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed by the universe itself. "Eilith, look at me. Open your eyes." She couldn't. The voices had teeth, now. They were pulling at her, dragging her somewhere deep and dark, somewhere she sensed she might not come back from. Then his arms were around her, lifting her off the cold floor, pulling her against his chest. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek, rapid and wild, nothing like the controlled steadiness she'd come to know. She felt his hand press against the back of her head, holding her close, and she felt the silence return, rushing in from the point of contact like water filling a vessel. The voices retreated. The white behind her eyes dimmed to gray, then resolved into the familiar shapes of his study. The desk, the maps, the afternoon light slanting through the windows. Theron's face was inches from hers. He was on the floor, on his knees, cradling her against him with both arms, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Terror, not the controlled, managed kind, not the stoic endurance she'd grown used to. Raw, unmasked, shattering terror, the face of a man watching something precious shatter in his hands. "What's happening to you?" he demanded. His voice was barely steady. "Tell me, now." Eilith tried to speak. Her throat wouldn't cooperate. She swallowed. Tried again. "The voices," she whispered. "I can hear them. I've been hearing them for weeks." The color drained from his face. "What? When I silence them for you, they don't disappear. I absorb them." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder because she couldn't look at his expression anymore. "It's getting worse." The silence that followed was catastrophic. She felt his arms tighten around her, felt a shudder pass through his body, and she knew with the certainty of a woman who had learned to read this man through touch and silence and the spaces between words, exactly what was coming. "How long?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Since the beginning." He made a sound then, a wounded guttural thing that came from somewhere deep and primal, the sound of an alpha realizing he'd been hurting the one person he most wanted to protect. "No," he said. The word was absolute, final. He pulled back, held her at arm's length, and his eyes were burning with something that might have been fury if it hadn't looked so much like grief. "No, this ends now, Theron." It was the first time she'd used his name. It stopped them both. The intimacy of it hung in the air, charged and electric, and for one Suspended moment, neither of them breathed. "This ends," he repeated, his voice rough. "You're leaving the East Wing tonight. The arrangement is over. You'll stop sleeping. The voices will come back." "Good." "That's not. I would rather hear every scream in this kingdom for the rest of my life," he said, each word measured and absolute, "than cause you one moment of pain. Do you understand me?" His hands were unsteady where they gripped her arms. His eyes were bright with something she realized, with a jolt that stole her breath, were unshed tears. "You will not suffer for me," he said. "I won't allow it. You can't just decide. I'm the king." His voice cracked on the word. "And I am asking you, please, go." The please destroyed her. Not the command, not the authority, not the king. The man. The broken, terrified, gentle man underneath all of it, begging her to save herself from him. Aelith's vision blurred. She reached for his face, cupped his jaw with both hands, and felt the muscle jump beneath her palms. "You don't get to decide what I can endure," she said, her voice barely audible. "And you don't get to decide what I can watch happen to you," he replied. He took her wrists, gently, carefully, with the tenderness of someone handling something infinitely fragile, and lowered her hands from his face. "Soren will escort you back to the healer's wing," he said. He stood, stepped back, and the distance between them opened like a wound. "Theron, go please," she went. Not because she wanted to, not because she agreed, but because the look on his face told her that if she stayed one more second, he would break entirely. She made it to the corridor before the tears came. The first night without her, Theron didn't sleep at all. Aelith knew, because Soren told Bryndis, and Bryndis told her, and the chain of whispered concern that connected them all tightened like a noose around Aelith's chest. The second night, he managed 40 minutes before the voices dragged him back. The third night, 20. By the fifth night, the tremor had returned to his hands, worse than before, visible even from across a room. The dark hollows under his eyes carved themselves back into his face like they'd never left, and the advisors who had grown accustomed to a sharp, present king found themselves once again speaking to a man who seemed to be listening to something else entirely. Aelith watched his decline from a distance and felt each stage of it like a blade between her ribs. She wasn't faring better. The voices that had been fragments before were now a constant undercurrent, a low tide of sound that never fully receded. She could function through it, barely, but the headaches had intensified to the point where light felt like an assault, and sound felt like glass. She moved through the infirmary with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating a world that had become too sharp, too bright, too much. And beneath the physical symptoms, something deeper was wrong. An ache had settled into her bones, a hollow gravitational pull centered somewhere behind her sternum that tugged constantly toward the east wing. She caught herself turning in that direction without thinking, her feet carrying her 3 corridors past the infirmary before her conscious mind caught up and forced her to stop. She'd stand there in the empty hallway, one hand pressed against the stone wall, and feel the pull like a physical tether stretched to breaking. Sidera found her again on the 6th day. Aelith was sitting on a bench in the inner courtyard, eyes closed against the midday sun, trying to breathe through a headache that felt like someone was driving a chisel through her left temple. She didn't hear Sidera approach. "I heard he dismissed you," Sidera said, her voice carrying the particular sweetness of someone savoring another person's misfortune. "Back to the healer's wing, where you belong." Aelith opened her eyes slowly. "Lady Sidera. You know, I tried to warn you." Sidera sat beside her uninvited, close enough that her perfume, something floral and expensive and entirely too strong, made Aelith's headache spike viciously. A wolfless girl playing at being important. It was always going to end this way. "And how is that? With you being put back in your place?" Sidera examined her nails with practiced indifference. "Whatever the king needed you for, he's clearly found a better solution. Or gotten bored. Kings do get bored, you know, especially with girls who have nothing to offer beyond novelty." The cruelty was precise and practiced, delivered with the casual confidence of a woman who had been sharpening words into weapons since childhood. But this time, it didn't land the way Sidera intended. Because Aelith knew something Sidera didn't. She knew the king's secret. She knew the weight he carried every second of every day. She knew the sound of his laugh and the shape of his hand in the dark and the way his voice broke when he said please. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he hadn't sent her away because he was bored. He'd sent her away because he loved her too much to watch her suffer. You're right, Aelith said quietly. He did send me away. Sidera smiled. Victorious. He sent me away, Aelith continued, because he thought he was hurting me. Because he would rather endure something unspeakable alone than risk causing me pain. She looked at Sidera directly, and for once she didn't flinch from the other woman's golden stare. That's not boredom, my lady. That's something you wouldn't recognize if it knelt at your feet. She stood and walked away, her spine straight, her hands steady, despite the pounding in her skull. Behind her, Sidera's silence was more satisfying than any retort could have been. That evening, Aelith found Bryndis in the back room of the healer's wing, surrounded by open texts and loose pages covered in the healer's cramped handwriting. The old woman had clearly not slept well in days. Her gray hair was escaping its pins, and there were ink smudges on her jaw where she'd been resting her face against her hand while reading. You've been researching, Aelith observed. I've been panicking productively, Bryndis corrected. She looked up, and Aelith saw the strain written across her mentor's face, like a map of everything she was afraid of. Sit down. We need to talk about what's happening to you. To both of you. Aelith sat. The bond between you and the king is not just emotional, Bryndis said, her voice taking on the clinical precision she used when delivering diagnoses she wished she didn't have to give. It's physiological, spiritual. It's a mate bond, Aelith, and it's been forming since the moment he first felt your silence. Aelith's heart stuttered. A mate bond? You're sure? The old texts are explicit. When a silencer encounters the wolf they're meant to bond with, the recognition is immediate and involuntary. The afflicted wolf feels relief. The silencer feels the pull. The bond begins forming, whether either party consents to it or not. Bryndis paused, choosing her next words with visible care. But it requires completion to function properly. An incomplete bond between a silencer and an afflicted wolf is not a neutral state, it's a degenerative one. It means that a completed mate bond would create a circuit. You absorb the psychic damage, you process it through your silencer nature, and you release it. The energy flows through you and dissipates harmlessly. It's sustainable. It's what silencers were designed for, and an incomplete bond is a broken circuit. You absorb, but you can't fully release. The energy accumulates inside you, with nowhere to go. It builds pressure, like water behind a cracked dam. Bryndis's voice dropped, and the gentleness in it was more frightening than anything she'd said so far. If the bond stays incomplete, the pressure will eventually destroy you. And because the bond connects you to him, his curse will intensify in direct proportion to your decline. You'll amplify each other's suffering in a feedback loop, until what? Until one of you breaks, Bryndis said. And then, the other. Follows. Weeks, Aelith, maybe less. The words landed like a sentence of execution. Aelith stared at her hands, at the faint shake she could no longer fully hide, and felt the truth of it settle into her marrow like ice, forming in still water. So, either we complete the bond, Aelith said, or we both die. There is a third option. Bryndis hesitated, and the hesitation itself told Aelith how much the healer hated what she was about to say. You leave Thornhaven entirely. Put enough distance between you and the king that the bond atrophies before it finishes forming. You would survive. Eventually. The process would be agonizing, but survivable. And him. Bryndis's silence was answer enough. Aelith stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor. Where is Soren? She found the beta in his office, reviewing patrol assignments by lamplight. The room was small and meticulous. Every map aligned, every stack of correspondence squared. It looked exactly like the mind of the man who occupied it. Soren looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or the quiet resignation of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "I was wondering how long it would take you," Soren said. "You knew. I suspected from the first night in the council chamber. The way he reacted to your presence was unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of service." Soren set down his pen and leaned back. "The king is not a man who shows relief. He showed relief the moment you walked into that room. Then I have to go back to him. I know he ordered you away. And I know that order is killing him." Soren paused, something warring behind his careful composure. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days. He can barely hold a pen steady enough to sign documents. The voices are worse than they've ever been. I found him this morning, standing in the corridor outside your old rooms in the East Wing, just standing there, with his hand pressed against the door." Aelith's chest constricted so tightly, she couldn't breathe for a moment. "The king will be furious if you return against his orders," Soren continued. "The king is dying." "Yes," Soren agreed quietly. "He is." He gave her the key to Theron's chambers. Not the servant's key, the one that opened only the outer door. The real key, the one that opened everything. "He won't forgive me for this," Soren said. "He will," Aelith replied. "Eventually, you're very confident, for someone who's about to defy a direct royal order. I'm very tired of watching the people I love destroy themselves out of stubbornness." Soren's mouth twitched. "Then you and I have that in common." The corridors were empty. The torches burned low, casting long shadows that stretched and contracted like breathing things. Aelith walked the familiar path to the East Wing with the key gripped so tightly in her hand that the metal teeth left marks in her palm. She could hear them already, even from the corridor, even through the reinforced doors. She could feel the vibration of the voices pressing outward like heat from a furnace. The curse was worse, much worse. A week without her, and whatever dam her presence had built was crumbling. She turned the key, pushed the door open. The chamber was dark, every candle extinguished, the fire dead. And in the center of the darkness, a sound that made her blood run cold. Theron was standing by the window, gripping the stone ledge with both hands, and his entire body was shaking, not trembling. Shaking, full-body convulsions that rattled through him like an earthquake. His head was bowed, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and when he turned to the sound of the door, his eyes were wrong. Not gray-black. Solid black, from corner to corner, as though the pupils had swallowed everything else. "Get out!" His voice was layered, doubled, as if a second voice was speaking beneath his own. Deeper, older, not his. "No," Aelith said. "You don't understand what's happening." He took a step back, pressing himself against the wall, and she could see his fingers gouging into the stone. "The curse. It's consuming me. It's taking over. If you're here when it takes us both," Aelith said, and stepped toward him. The moment she touched him, the world fell away, not slowly, not gently. It was as though the floor had been pulled out from beneath both of them, and they were plunging through the dark into something vast and formless and impossibly deep. Aelith had expected the fog. What she fell into was nothing like fog. It was sound, an ocean of it, stretching in every direction, black and depthless and roaring. She was drowning in voices, hundreds of them, thousands, each one a final breath, a last word, a scream, cut short. The accumulated dying sounds of every wolf lost in Theron's kingdom since the crown had passed to him, preserved and compacted and pressed into a space that existed somewhere between his mind and hers. She couldn't see. The sound was so dense it was physical, pressing against her eyes, her mouth, her skin, filling every space until there was nothing else. Theron. Her voice was swallowed instantly, consumed by the roar. But she could feel him. The bond, incomplete as it was, pulled taut between them like a rope in a storm, and she followed it through the noise, hand over hand, dragging herself toward the center. She found him at the bottom. He was kneeling in the dark, just as he'd been kneeling in his chambers, but here the weight on him was visible. Chains of sound, dense and shimmering, wound around his wrists, his chest, his throat, connecting him to every voice in the ocean. Each chain led to a different death, a different soul, a different moment of failure that he had claimed as his own. He was the anchor. He was holding all of them, carrying every lost life, every scream, every death echo, not because the curse forced him to, but because he wouldn't let go, because he believed he deserved to carry them. The curse was feeding on his guilt. It had found the wound in him, the belief that a king who couldn't save everyone deserved to hear everyone die, and it had poured itself into that wound until the wound became a well, and the well became an ocean, and the ocean became this. Theron. She reached him, dropped to her knees in front of him, gripped his face between her hands. His skin was ice cold. His eyes were open, but unseeing, lost somewhere in the depths of a guilt so consuming it had built its own world. I hear them, he whispered. All of them. Every single one. I know. The boy from Ashenfield, whose patrol was ambushed because I moved the border guard south. A chain tightened around his wrist. The woman from Thornhaven who died in the fire because the alarm bells weren't repaired. Another chain around his chest. The old man from the western villages who froze because the supply caravan was delayed by my order. Another. Every one of them. Every single death. My responsibility. My failure. Your kingdom. Aelith countered, her voice fierce through the noise. Not your failures. Your kingdom. Where people lived and died, as people do, under a king who did everything he could. It wasn't enough. It's never enough. Tears streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the roar surrounding them. That's not a flaw in you. That's the nature of being alive. No one saves everyone. No one can. A king should. A king is a man, Aelith said. And a man who carries every death he couldn't prevent isn't being noble. He's being devoured. She pressed her forehead against his. You are being devoured, Theron, and I won't watch it happen. The chains pulsed, the voices surged, and through the bond, she felt the depth of what he carried. Not just guilt, but shame. The bone-deep conviction that he was fundamentally insufficient, that a better king, a stronger king, would have prevented every loss. That the voices were his punishment, and he deserved every one of them. She recognized it. Not because she'd read about it, because she'd lived it. I know this feeling, she said, her voice raw. I know it the way I know my own heartbeat. The belief that if you'd just been more, been better, been enough, the thing you lost would have stayed. Her voice broke. I spent 23 years believing my parents abandoned me because something was wrong with me. Because I was wolfless. Because I was broken. Because I wasn't worth keeping. I built my entire life around being useful, being invisible, being small enough that no one would notice me and decide I wasn't worth the space I occupied. Theron's eyes focused on her, really focused, present and sharp, as though a veil had lifted. And I was wrong, she said softly. I wasn't broken. I was something so rare, so different, that no one in this entire kingdom recognized it, including me. She gripped his hands, the chains cold and vibrating against her skin. You're not broken either. You're a man who cared so much about his people that a curse found a foothold in that caring and turned it into a prison. But the prison only holds because you keep locking the door from the inside. Aelith, the voices aren't your punishment. They're your wound. And this curse has been feeding on that wound since the day it began, growing stronger, because you keep agreeing with it. Because every night you kneel here and say, yes, I deserve this, and the chains get tighter, and the ocean gets deeper, and the man I love disappears a little more. The word love cut through the roar, like a blade through silk. She felt it land in him through the bond, felt the shock and the ache, and the desperate, hungry hope that he'd been starving for longer than he would ever admit. Let them go, she said, not because they don't matter. Not because their deaths don't count, but because carrying them like this doesn't honor them. It buries you with them. And I refuse, her voice cracked. I refuse to lose you to your own guilt when I just found you. I don't know how, he said, and his voice cracked wide open, and the sound of it, the raw surrender in it, was the most heartbreaking thing she had ever heard. I do. Aelith closed her eyes. She could feel her wolf, the silencer, stirring for the first time in her life. Not a beast, but a force, a vast, quiet, limitless stillness rising from somewhere deep inside her. The part of herself she'd spent 23 years thinking was absence was actually presence. Not emptiness, but capacity. A silence so profound, it could hold anything and release it gently. This is what I am, she realized, with a clarity that rang through her like a bell. This is what I was always meant for. She opened the channel, not the fractured, leaking absorption that had been happening for weeks. The full circuit. She pulled the voices into herself, and instead of holding them, she let them pass through her mind, through her heart, through the silence that was her birthright, and out the other side. The sensation was indescribable. Each voice passed through her, carrying its own story, its own final moment, and she witnessed every one of them. Not as a horror, not as a punishment, as a memory, a life that had mattered. A person who had existed and been real and deserved to be remembered, not as a chain around a king's throat, but as a name in a record. A story written down, a life honored, and then gently set free. And this was the most important record she would ever keep. The chains began to dissolve, one by one, then in cascades. The shimmering bonds of sound unwound from Theron's body and passed through Aelith like light through water. Each one left behind a name, a face, a moment of life, and she held them briefly, acknowledged them, and released them into the silence. Theron was shaking. His hands gripped hers so hard, the bones ground together. She could feel his resistance through the bond, the deep, reflexive clinging of a man terrified to let go of the only penance he knew. Years of self-punishment didn't release easily. It had roots in him, deep ones tangled around his identity. If I release them, he breathed, what am I? Free, Aelith said. You're free, and you're mine. The last chain fell, the ocean collapsed, the darkness shattered. The roaring silence rushed inward from every direction, and at the center of it, in the absolute quiet, Theron Vael lowered his head and wept. Not the restrained, controlled grief of a king. The raw, broken, consuming grief of a man who had finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd been carrying, and to set it down. All the accumulated sorrow and guilt and shame pouring out of him in a torrent that seemed endless, each sob tearing free from somewhere fundamental, somewhere that had been locked shut and barricaded and now lay wide open. Aelith held him. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders and held him while his body shook, and she pressed her lips to his temple and whispered his name, again and again, an anchor in the silence. The bond completed itself. She felt it happen, not with the sharp snap of something breaking, but with the deep, resonant hum of something falling into alignment. Two halves of a circuit finally connecting, the current flowing clean and clear between them. His grief poured through the bond, and she met it with steady, quiet love. Her loneliness poured back, and he met it with a fierceness that took her breath away. The exchange was equal, balanced, sustainable. Not one person carrying the other, but both carrying each other, they surfaced together. Aelith opened her eyes in his chambers, on the floor, tangled together in the dark. His arms were around her, her face was pressed against his chest. Both of them were crying, and neither of them cared. Is it gone? She asked, her voice raw. Theron was quiet for a long time. She felt him listening, reaching inward for the place inside his skull where the voices had lived since the curse took hold, reaching and finding nothing, just stillness. Just the sound of his own breathing and hers and the fire that had somehow relit itself, crackling softly in the grate. Yes, he said, and the wonder in his voice was so immense it broke her heart and healed it simultaneously. "It's quiet. Aelith, it's quiet." She pulled back to look at his face. His eyes were gray again, winter-like gray, but warmer now, softer, wet with tears and bright with something she had never seen in them before. Peace. Softly, at first, tentative, as though asking permission, his hand unsteady against her cheek, and when she kissed him back, something ignited between them that burned steady and golden and sure. He pulled her closer, his hands cradling her face like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held, and she felt the bond hum with a completeness that resonated in every cell of her body. "I love you," he said against her mouth. "I have loved you since the moment the world went quiet." "I love you," she replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the arch of his cheekbone, learning the geography of a face she never wanted to stop seeing. "I have loved you since you left a candle burning for a girl you wouldn't look at." He laughed, broken and beautiful and real, and then he kissed her again, deeper this time, and the silence between them was no longer absence. It was presence, it was fullness, it was everything they'd both been searching for without knowing it had a name. The curse didn't vanish without consequence. Theron still woke some nights with his heart racing, reaching for a sound that was no longer there. Phantom echoes, Brindis called them. The mind, remembering what the spirit had released. They would fade, she promised. They did, slowly, week by week, until the nights he slept peacefully outnumbered the ones he didn't. Aelith's headaches lingered for nearly a month. The residual energy of 1,000 absorbed voices took time to fully dissipate, even through a completed bond. But with each passing day, the ringing quieted, the pressure eased, and she felt herself becoming something she'd never been before, whole, not fixed, because she hadn't been broken, revealed. The wolf she'd carried in silence her entire life was awake now, not a beast that shifted, but a steady, luminous presence that hummed beneath her skin like a quiet flame. The court adjusted to their queen with varying degrees of grace. A wolfless foundling. Though the term no longer applied, old labels died hard. Now mated to the Alpha King, the whispers were predictable and relentless. But they faded, because anyone who spent more than 10 minutes in the same room as Theron and Aelith could see the truth written across both their faces. The king, who had been slowly dying, was alive, not just surviving. Sharp, decisive, present in a way that made the previous 3 years look like a man governing through a fog. And beside him, always beside him, was the quiet woman with the steady hands and the knowing smile of someone who had spent her life recording other people's stories and was finally living her own. Soren, when asked about the change in his king, offered his assessment with characteristic brevity. He laughs now. That alone is worth the chaos. Brindis, for her part, said nothing at all. She simply watched her foundling girl walk through the palace halls with a crown on her head and a king's hand in hers, and smiled the quiet, fierce smile of a woman whose life's work had just exceeded every expectation she'd ever held for it. "You're staring," Aelith murmured one morning, without opening her eyes. Theron's arm tightened around her waist. "I'm memorizing." "Memorizing what?" "What silence looks like when it's happy." Aelith opened her eyes, turned to face him, and found him watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch in the best possible way. She kissed the corner of his mouth. "You don't need to memorize it." "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "But I spent 3 years unable to appreciate quiet. Let me be excessive about it." She laughed softly and settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and slow and wonderfully unremarkable. Outside, the kingdom of Thornhaven stirred awake, its wolves rising to meet a day governed by a king who finally slept through the night. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of a bond that had been forged in silence and sealed in trust, the king and his mate lingered a little longer. There was no hurry. The quiet would keep. It was theirs now, and it was full.